So Gordon Square is part of an area of London known as Bloomsbury, which is northwest London, just south of Euston Station and of a whole line of great train stations. It's an area that used to be large aristocratic agricultural estates, and then was developed into mostly residential area. Like all these kind of squares or terraces around beautiful green squares that are so kind of admired as part of the London urban fabric. They were built on spec, really, for a large aristocratic landlord, the Duke of Bedford.
Gordon Square was the last of the 7 squares on the Dukes of Bedford's Bloomsbury estate to be completed. It kicked off in about 1660 with Bloomsbury Square, and then after a gap of about 100 years, Bedford Square, which is really the core and historic heart of the estate. And then in about 1800, a plan for the whole of the rest of the estate appeared, another 5 squares, and Gordon Square was the last of these. And we can see behind us the first section of the square to be completed, which was in about 1830. And the whole of the rest of the square took about 30 years to be complete.
When you go and look at them from the outside, I mean, there you can really see what they would have looked like originally. And you can see these repeated doorways, which indicate that it was a series of separate houses. But what's interesting about it, too, is that the designer, Thomas Cubitt, thought of it not, in fact, as discrete units, but as one kind of coherent architectural formulation. And so you get the use of classical details, the pilasters, the cornices, the way that elements of the building are picked out in white stucco against the red brick, that creates that sense of a kind of simple order and harmony.
The original inhabitants were not grand. Elite London was further west in Mayfair and Belgravia, but they were thoroughly respectable, middle class, upper middle class people. And they would have been physicians and lawyers and academics from the university and people who worked at the British Museum, and increasingly people who were involved in the charitable and socially responsible element of Bloomsbury, which I suppose became evident from halfway through the 19th century.
The traditional arrangement of these houses is that you have, so the kitchen and the servants' bedroom was in the basement. The ground floor tended to be the dining room and studies for the men of the household. Women did not have a room of their own, but what there was as a feminine space was the upstairs, the first floor front room, so the room in which we are in, which would have been the drawing room, as in the room where women withdrew after supper, leaving the men downstairs to drink and smoke.
Then there was a very important moment in the early 20th century, which really just has to do with the decision of a family to rent one of the units. And it happens to be one of the units that Birkbeck owns and is now incorporated within the School of Arts. And that was number 46, Gordon Square, which was in 1904 rented out by an unusual family, 3 siblings, who were very young, whose parents had died and who moved in. And those were, of course, the Stephen siblings, including Vanessa Stephen, Virginia Stephen, and Toby Stephen. And Virginia would become Virginia Woolf, Vanessa would become Vanessa Bell.
By the time the Stevens family arrived here in 1904, the area was probably less homogeneous than it had been in the 1830s and 1840s. And in fact, one of the reasons that the Stevens family came to live here was that it was less stuffy and less restricted than Kensington.
They start having salons here, and the name Bloomsbury comes to be associated with modernist innovation and with experimentation in art and literature.
This was also one of the first experiments in modernizing these kind of 19th century terraced houses. They had big ideas about wanting to live a different lifestyle. There were few fabrics, the walls were painted white, the floorboards were bare, with just a few rugs. The room that we're here at the moment was given over to Vanessa for her painting because it had high ceilings. There are a number of paintings which actually show the view outside, and one can recognize the banister. There are paintings both by her and by Duncan Grant, who lived here for a while. Virginia had one of the rooms upstairs under the roof for her writing room, and that as a kind of resonance because of one of Virginia Woolf's famous essay about the importance for women to have a room of their own in which they could write or paint, and in which especially they had the right to ask to be on their own and to be excused from familial duties. And so that room upstairs was the first time that she actually had a room of her own, and where she must have realized the importance of that idea of having a space of your own in which to work.
So the kind of middle story is basically University of London and then Birkbeck taking over this building in a pretty patchy way, knocking all the houses together. They did that not for the Department of History of Art or the School of Arts as it is now, but rather for the Department of Computer Science. And so to accommodate that, all the huge mainframe computers that they used back in the 70s when it became the Department of Computer Science, they built a large concrete block on the back of the building. And once that was no longer needed, the decision was made to turn that into the Center for Film and Media.
The building that we inherited for the project was originally a computer mainframe suite. So it was quite a utilitarian building, over 2 floors. It didn't have any windows, and we were installing the cinema within that space. We became very interested in the writing of Virginia Woolf, in particular her kind of narratives of streams of consciousness, and that inspired us with the project. And the narrative that we created was of a tumbling block that moved through the space and changed its characteristics as it moved. So it changed its shape, its colour and its material. And like a stop frame animation, we analysed the motion of the tumbling block at certain stages and the imprint that it left on, or the residue that it left on the existing space or the existing block conceptually. And that process carved a series of interlocking forms and spaces that you see here.
It's very interior in some senses. It's very self-enclosed. It has, of course, this cinema where there are no windows or no outlet to the outside world. But then it has this very dramatic kind of gesture where all this breaks through out into the outside, and you get this picture window facing onto the back of the terrace. And so this window then is the connection through to the historic built environment of Bloomsbury. The building, when you look at it from the outside, as I described, has that sense of unity to it. And of course now we do use it as one building, at least this section of the terrace that Birkbeck has. But really our use of it in a way contradicts the way that it was originally built, because there was never any sense that in fact the buildings on the inside would ever communicate with each other or be joined together in any way. That was in a way an illusion created by the design. And if you come into this building and you're looking for your classroom, looking for your tutor's office, you will probably get lost the first few times you try to do that. And that is as a result of having to turn a building that was something into something really quite different.
I think the difference between Gordon Square now and Gordon Square in 1860, when it was completed, is that it's now a much more diverse space. If you walk through it at about 6 o'clock at night when classes are just starting at the School of Arts, you will see young people, old people, people from every part of the globe all rushing into this building to experience a most extraordinary range of classes. So the social and presumably political homogeneity envisaged by the Bedford Estate in the early 19th century has completely disappeared.
In many ways, the building is really used very differently from how it was originally intended, which is the case for many, many buildings in London.